Well, red squirrel's the subject of this 10 by 7 inch transparent watercolor, and this painting was a lot of fun to work on, and it was something that I had the sketch for ages, but I just kind of never got around to doing it. And part of that was because it was more of a straight illustration rather than a painting where I worried about composition and all these things. It was a very straightforward piece of work. So the first thing I had was the sketch, and I transferred the main lines of that over to some tracing paper and then put that on the watercolor paper and frisketed it off the squirrel. And you can see me doing that here. I have a homemade tool that I use for getting the little fine hairy parts, and then I use my finger to cover the big areas. Once I had that frisketed off and dried, I pre-wet the page and made sure it was soaked very evenly. And then I put in a mixture of blues across the background with some cerulean, some ultramarine, and a little bit of dioxazine purple at the far end. And you can see at the far end of it, I often wick off some of the extra pigment so it doesn't puddle up at the edges. And then I hit that with the hairdryer. And these are kind of granulating pigments, so they're not as smooth as they might be otherwise. So I put in a second wash, this time mostly of the cerulean and the ultramarine, and then hit that with the hairdryer again. And again, being granular pigments, these were left a little bit of that grainy look to it. So I went through and hit it with a third wash because I wanted to build some intensity to this, and I don't always get that if I do it with just one wash. So I'm building that tone in a couple of passes. And there's a little bit of streaking that you can see that was happening here, which I wasn't entirely happy about. But I like the overall colors. I like that purple to the lighter blue shift. So I took a Hake brush and just puddled up the paper and stroked it a bit to loosen the pigment to make it even, and then dried it again. And this left me with a nice even background, and it took a while to get there, but in the end it was just what I was looking for. It had a little bit of grain, make it interesting, not just an airbrushy background, but it looks like watercolor, but it doesn't have any imperfections in it. So then I transferred the rest of the sketch after I peeled off the frisket. Here comes a squirrel, and the fun begins. So I think at this point I was using kind of some different mixtures. For the tree branch I put in some greens in with the browns, and for the squirrel I was using a lot of different mixed browns, usually starting with a burnt sienna and kind of and yellow ochres and kind of working from there. And the majority of the work on the squirrel was really done with a number 6 round, a fairly large brush considering the area. And just many glazes kind of going in the regular direction of the fur. And just pass after pass after pass, trying to get the colors right. You can see I'm bringing in some purples and yellows and all these other colors that in the end make it look very, very correct color-wise, but there's actually a fair amount of color in there. It's not just brown. We get a lot of these red squirrels in our yard, and we kind of have a love-hate affair with them. They're great fun and they're beautiful animals, but they love eating all the food out of our bird feeder. So we've had many efforts on squirrel-proofing our bird feeders, and the red squirrels are just so much tougher to dissuade than the fox squirrels. The fox squirrels get the idea pretty quickly, and the red squirrels are just so much, I don't know if they're smarter or what. They're definitely, they bully the you can see my photo reference on the left. They bully the fox squirrels, which amazes me because they're so much smaller. But and they're also really clever and really fast, so you kind of admire them at the same time. So at any rate, we've had many things trying to get this to keep the squirrels out of the feeder. We had one thing that squirted them with water, and we had another one that jingled bells and shook the feeder. And in the end, we made one that used an old bread machine motor, and it has a remote control to it. And so we made this thing so from in the house you can spin the bird feeder to get the squirrels off it. And that has worked great for a couple of years now, and we've not had problems with the red squirrels since then. They hop on, but they get the idea very quickly. So you can see that the squirrel's building that texture nicely, and it's starting to play well against the background. So I specifically pushed the background colors kind of in that purplish range because I knew that those were really going to pop our orangey colors of the squirrel off the page more. In my photo reference, it was more just a straight blue and didn't have that purpley kind of quality to it. And it's not as literally painted. You can see that in the photo reference, the squirrel's tail kind of goes a little bit transparent at the edges. Could that be done in watercolor? Yeah. Would it be very difficult to do in transparent watercolor? Yeah. So when I did this, I specifically made the tail a bit bushier and fuller than it appeared in the photo. Part of that was a compromise to get it done in transparent watercolor. And I think it reads correctly. And it reads as a bushy tail with a little bit of that transparency without being literally, that you can see through it in places. It gives the idea of it. So you can see how those many, many, many layers of pigment start building up a realistic look to the fur. And in the end, I'm using mostly number 2 round for all this, and I back painted in some of those purpley blues into the edge of the tail to kind of give it a little bit more, less of a hard edge to it. This was a painting. I asked my wife, what painting should I do next? She said, you need to do a squirrel. You haven't done a squirrel. You need to do that little red squirrel. So she put it at the top of the list. I don't know. It was a lot of fun to do, so I think she was right. Its time had come. And you can see barely in the video that there's just pencil lines where the whiskers are going to go. I saved those for the end. And then I put those in with a crow quill pen that I load with watercolor. And you can see me using that crow quill. That's super sharp, and I can get a very fine line. But I have to wait till the very end so it goes on top of the other pigments. If I were to do that earlier, it would like to bleed. So there you go. It's a red squirrel, a 10 by 7 inch transparent watercolor. This one was a blast to paint. Hope you liked it. If you get a chance, leave a comment or visit the blog and the website.